All right, we're back, ladies and gentlemen. Let's start our show. We are moving on, right? We were just talking about these problems, right? So what do you do, right? What can you do? The British will basically enact laws, enforce old laws, and raise taxes. Those are the three main things, and laws and taxes. And this is going to anger the heck out of the colonies. Remember mercantilism, everybody? The idea of whoever makes the most money wins in the end? Well, this will be the philosophy or the guiding strategy behind everything that happens, right? So, and this is not new. I really want to stress that there's nothing new happening. The British didn't try to like hurt the Americans straight out. They just actually tried to enforce some old stuff. For example, the wool, hat, and iron axe. These were old laws that have been around for a long time that basically will, for example, wool. You couldn't make the sweater in the Americas. You could raise the sheep, but you had to sell the wool to England because more money was made that way. The hat, the fur came from the Americas, but you had to make the hat back in Europe because, again, there's more money made there. So it's taking primary resources and sending it to Europe to make stuff and sell it and make more money and have more jobs and to benefit the home country, right? We also had the Molasses Act, right? The Molasses Act of 1733. These are all before the war. Tax on the sugar. But of course there was huge, the biggest smuggling that happened was around molasses because there was big money in molasses. I already mentioned the strict enforcement of the Navigation Acts. Now we're getting to the point of responding to the war and the huge debt. So the next big thing is the Sugar Act, 1764, the year after the war is over. A huge new tax, a duty on imported sugar. And this outrages the colonists, right? There's bitter protests, but people need their sugar, so what are they going to do, right? And the British push on. The Quartering Act of 1765, requiring Americans in the colonies to house the troops, save some money, right? Instead of building, barracks, you just house them in people's homes and make them feed them. And then there's the big one, the turning point, you could say, the Stamp Act of 1765. This was a tax on a lot of different items, all legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, and you had to buy this little stamp and put it on it for that to be a legal document. So amazingly, the British, I don't know what they were thinking, managed to just put a tax that most affects, more than anybody else, journalists, newspapermen, and lawyers. Those are two groups that you don't really actually want to anger. Let me make sure we're still recording, and yes, we are, and I want to make sure that the camera is still kind of got us right. Okay, so back to our Stamp Act. Sorry about that. The Stamp Act will absolutely outrage the colonists, right? What were they thinking? Well, they were thinking. That's the amazing thing. And so I want to go into Roman numeral 3 in your notes. There was a logic behind the British responses, both the new taxes and how they dealt with it, okay? And the guy we need to remember is Grenville. He is the British guy in charge of the colonies at this point. And he's the one who passes a lot of these acts, right? So what is Grenville thinking, you know? He thought he was being reasonable. He thought, well, why shouldn't they have to pay some taxes? Everybody else in England is paying taxes. They paid less taxes in the colonies than they did in England. Plus, it was a war for their own country, you know, so doesn't it make a little bit of sense, right? Well, no. Not to the colonists. It outrages the colonists, right? And the famous battle cry, no taxation without representation. It's even on the Washington, D.C. license plate, right? But actually it's the taxation without representation. And it's a different story why it's on their license plate, but it's related. This cry, right? You can't tax us because you're over there in England and we're over here in America, and so you're making decisions for us that we don't have any say. There's a great and powerful irony there that was going on within the colonies, right? And then you'll see in your notes the word regulator movement. This was a violent rebellion that happens in 1771. And it's because in the Carolinas, especially North Carolina, the backcountry guys felt like they were being taxed by the big cities on the coast. And then the people in the big cities on the coast turn around and say, hey, we're being taxed by the people in England. So you've got this sense of being oppressed, but at the same time oppressing somebody else, and that's important to recognize. But anyways, the British respond with this phrase down below there, virtual representation. They say, what are you talking about? You're not represented. Of course you're represented. Parliament represents all of the British Empire. Everyone's represented by the members of Parliament. Even if you didn't vote for them, they represent you. So you were virtually represented long before, of course, the internet and all that good stuff. The American colonists don't really buy this, right? And so what happens? What happens is a lot of outrage and a lot of protests. Very specifically, the most important, maybe politically speaking, is the Stamp Act Congress, 1765. What even a war couldn't do, this little tax did, and it brought 9 colonies together to have a meeting, to make a plan, and to come to an agreement as to what to do. And they decided to use direct action, protests like boycotts and embargoes, making their own stuff, not using the British stuff. And so the protests took all kinds of forms. You can see on this newspaper, right? They put where the stamp is supposed to go. I'll show you the close-up. It says, "This is the place to affix the stamp," right? So obviously, skull and crossbones, this is going to kill us, destroy us. You can't tax us like this. My all-time favorite protest was the Teakettle. This is just a drawing of it. I couldn't find an original, but I would love to. A Teakettle, made in England, mind you, with a big No Stamp Act. So you can pour your tea and show the world that you are against the Stamp Act as you drink your tea. What a rebel, right? And there was more, right? Beyond these little forms of protest and direct action, we also see violence breaking out. Here you see a tax collector who's just been tarred and feathered, and in this case, tea is being poured down his throat. This one's more related to the Tea Party. We'll get to that. But things get out of hand, right? I mean, you have these groups that roam the cities, like in Boston, destroying homes, torturing, sometimes killing. The people working for the English government, tarring, feathering, abusing, humiliating. What do we call people who use this kind of violence to fight for their cause? Well, it depends on which side of the argument you're on, right? Some might call him a terrorist. There's that phrase, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. These guys were known as the Sons of Liberty, and we consider them heroes in our history. But in many ways, they were bullies who went too far at the time, right? We win the war, of course, though, so then we can remember them as heroes. Amazingly, the Stamp Act is repealed. The British, they go back on it. They can't deal with the violence and the protests, and so they actually repeal it. But what happens when you repeal something because everybody protests? What is that? What's the message you're sending, right? They won. They'll do it again. But the British, they saw that coming, and so they passed, as in your notes there, a very important declaratory act, which stated, we are giving in to you, but we can tax you whenever we want later. I call that the 3rd grade playground rule, right? Nanny, nanny, poo, poo, we can still tax you. Yeah, doesn't really work. On the verge of revolution. I want to stress very importantly that people didn't feel like they were on the verge of a revolution. People were outraged, right? But nobody was organizing armies and getting ready to fight yet. That wasn't happening at all. They were, in fact, as they demanded their rights, they demanded them as Englishmen. They said, we are Englishmen, and we demand to be treated like Englishmen rather than like children. And this is really important. And actually, they wanted to stay English. There are very few at this point in history that would say we shouldn't be English, because there were great benefits of being English, right? Good trade partner, unless you were a smuggler. Virginians loved being English. They had a tobacco monopoly, right? They had the world's best navy protecting them. These are important. I would write these down, right? This Virginia tobacco monopoly, this protection from the navy, guaranteed trade partner, shipping, all kinds of things. But you're being treated like a child. And so the benefits seem to disappear pretty quickly, right? So next up, the Townshend Acts, right? There's another set of taxes in 1767, which is the first year on this chart. It looks like 68, but we're going to see that as the effect of the Townshend Acts. These are taxes on all kinds of things like tea and glass and paint and paper, paid by merchants rather than the actual people buying them. So it doesn't seem as obvious, not as many people affected right away. But of course, more outrage, right? And this chart will show you that even though there's outrage, there's still trade going on. This is all about the trade. That really, when we get to later, which is going to be the Coercive Acts, it will plummet. Let's see, Boston Massacre, we're not quite ready for that yet. The response is, again, immediate boycott, more direct action, more protests, more violence, and of course more unity of the colonies, right? And lots of smuggling and lawlessness. The British government sees that they're losing control. They send 2 regiments of their redcoats, their army, to Boston in 1768, and that's what's going to lead to this incredibly famous incident in American history, the Boston Massacre. Look very closely at this engraving / painting. This was made by Paul Revere, who's much more famous for what he does later with his famous ride that wasn't exactly what he did or said, but it's close enough. The British Army will actually shoot into a crowd of English Americans, but this is a slightly exaggerated engraving because it wasn't just a bunch of guys in line shooting at a bunch of innocent civilians. It was more of a mob riot kind of violent situation. The mob was throwing stuff at the soldiers. The soldiers were tired. They were moonlighting. They were doing multiple jobs. 11 will be killed, shot and killed. The first man to die was actually Crispus Attucks. His name's not on your notes, I don't think, but he was African American. So that's interesting to note. If we look at this later picture, this was 1856, right before the Civil War, a reimagining, if you will, that puts front and center the African American. It's sort of a message saying that African Americans were willing to fight and die for our country even before it was our country. So how can we continue to enslave them, right? I want to go back to the original picture. What's important about this engraving is that it's an engraving, which means you can make lots of copies and you can spread it around. So in a time when there's no TV or radio, this image goes around, and of course it exaggerates, right? A court in Boston finds these guys actually more or less innocent. In fact, John Adams, a hero of our revolution, will defend them as having basically been in a situation that was out of hand with a very unruly mob. But this makes it seem like an armed, organized killing, which is not at all what it was. Moving on. We have the Gaspé incident. Oh, I skipped the... the Gaspé incident, that's where we are. This was a few years later, 1772. It's a ship that runs aground. You know, an accident, this could happen, right? But what happens next is the American colonists pillage the boat, steal and take everything, and the ship is burned. And nobody will admit who did it, including the authorities who seem to know. And so the English government is outraged at this taking of belongings, right? The Committees of Correspondence that same year will be formed. And these were started by Samuel Adams, put together across 80 cities in the colonies, and they really had this goal of letting each other know what was happening. How were the British treating us and abusing us? And what the result is, they really will help to spread a resistance movement. They'll start to really become an organization that would later become governments of these different colonies, right? The famous Tea Act, 1773, I'm not going to go into any detail, but in fact what most people don't realize is that it didn't raise the price of tea. It was going to make tea cheaper, but it was going to require the Americans to buy their tea only from one source, because there was this monopoly, right? And that will outrage the colonists, right? The British are totally surprised because they expect that everyone's going to be happy. Cheap tea, right? Who wouldn't want things cheaper, they thought. Instead, we have this incredibly famous act in history, the Boston Tea Party, a group of guys dressing up as Native Americans, sneaking aboard the ship, throwing the tea off, outraging the British government. What do? They issue the Coercive / Intolerable Acts. This is a critical moment in our history because these acts will be kind of like a final straw, right? Well, close to it. Lord North issues these acts. There's 4 of them. We have the Port Bill, right? And it was the Americans that called it the Intolerable Acts, by the way. They didn't call it that themselves. They closed down the Boston port, right, because of the Tea Party. And this, of course, will outrage a lot of people because is that fair? Because of a group of 30 guys, you shut down the business of an entire city? Is that a bit extreme? That's what Thomas Jefferson will argue later. The Administration of Justice Act is another big one, which said that any soldier who was caught breaking a law would be taken back to England to be tried. This was outrageous to the Americans, right? The Massachusetts Government Act, they shut down the Massachusetts government. No more meetings, no more voting, no more anything. It's going to be the king and his governor. And then the Quebec Act, right? The Quebec Act, which was a really good law at the time, or was a good law at the wrong time. It will enlarge Quebec. It will give freedom of language and religion to the French. It will make, essentially, Canada want to stay English because they gave them so many rights. Well, we'll look at the map here, right? And it will outrage the colonists because, again, it's that land that they fought for. That Indian country will more or less be ceded to the Quebecers. So here it is, right? That whole Ohio River Valley is going to be made a part of Quebec. The American colonists will do kind of an "are you kidding me" moment. How is this possible, right? Here's another little map that shows British colony, Indian Reserve, and what is to be the new Quebec. Thomas Jefferson publishes his famous Summary Review of the Rights of British America. This is a document in 1774 that lists all of these things as gross overreactions. What are they thinking? This is tyranny. You can't punish us with one tax after another and then, when a small rabble does something, destroy our economy, right? He's outraged, and he writes it very well, and it'll draw a lot of attention, and it'll get him the invite to later write our Declaration of Independence. Also important, it leads to the founding of the first Continental Congress. It was just too much, right? It was just too much, and so these leaders, 55 delegates from 12 colonies, Rhode Island still didn't make it, still causing trouble, those Rhode Islanders, and they had to come up with a plan. How do we respond to this Coercive Act, this Quebec Act, all this business, right? And you had a lot of variety. You had your radicals who wanted independence. You had the first voice in 74, but they were radicals. There were very few of them. They included Patrick Henry, Sam and John Adams, mostly New Englanders, right? Then you had your moderates who really wanted to repair relations, your George Washingtons, your Virginians. And then you even had some conservatives who, the moderates wanted an apology. They wanted to fix the situation, but they wanted to stay English, of course. The conservatives didn't even want to challenge the king. This is just what we have to do. Each colony got a vote. There they are. It looks a little bit like the Trianon. And they made these three important, fateful decisions, right? They said, we're going to totally boycott all British goods. We're going to only make our own stuff. We're going to set up our first Continental Army, organized across the colonies. And they declared these intolerable acts null and void. They said, nope, we have the power to just say, you can't do that. Your laws are null and void. We don't accept it. We take it back. The results of this will be an outraged, angry England. And, of course, you see just a complete destruction in the trades, a financial impact, big time, right? Even, during the war there was almost more trade, barely, but a teeny bit more. And then we have our next major event, April 1775, a whole year before the War of Independence, we have our first shooting. And it's the famous incidents at Lexington and Concord. What happens is the British Army is sent to confiscate militia weapons, the American weapons. They get these rumors. They're also looking for Sam Adams and John Hancock, two of the rabble-rousers. And so this massive army marches on Lexington, right? And they arrive, and the Americans refuse to disperse, and the shot rings out. They kill 8 Americans, just in a line, standing there, right? It's called the shot heard round the world. That was a famous American philosopher Emerson in the 1800s, because it starts the revolution that will bring freedom and democracy all around the planet. The soldiers then head off to Concord, right? That's their next destination. And they're going to be walking down this little narrow road. And it's a great painting here, because what you see is, in Lexington, a massacre of Americans. At Concord, it's a total massacre of the British. 300 injured. They're walking down this road, and the English are fighting Indian style. The Americans, hiding in the little corners, hiding in the nooks and crannies, behind rocks, famously waiting in front of bridges, ambush and surprise, and just totally demoralizing and demolishing the British. It was awful. The British limped their way back to Boston, having totally failed and lost a ton of men. Very dramatic stuff, this Battle of Lexington and Concord. One last thing, and then we're going to cut, and I'll do the rest on Thursday. This is in Chapter 4. Lots of stuff going on there. I'm not going to go into detail, but I do want to stress 2 points. The first one is letter A, this idea of the importance of understanding the growth of rebellions in the colonies. none of the rebellions that we look at, and there were 18 of these by 1760. We talked about Bacon's Rebellion, and the Regulator Movement. There were 18 different uprisings that didn't try to replace the crown. They tried to replace the governors. Along with these 18, there were 6 slave rebellions. There were 40 different riots. There was a lot of violence and a lot of turbulence. And we got to keep that in mind, and that's one of the great strengths of the article, of the chapter. And then also the idea of growing inequalities, right? The idea that a smaller and smaller amount of the population is controlling more and more of the wealth. Poverty is growing, and wealth is also growing at the same time. And that brings us to the next battle that's not considered a battle, that's obviously a battle, and that is going to be the acts of Ethan Allen and Bunker Hill. But I'm going to pause us here. We are going to stop and continue later. Thanks, everybody.